Hi. How's it going?
Hello, welcome to Everyday Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading a story, Dad, You Are Not Dead. And we are going to be reading the Bible today. Then we are
I got my sword.
The Bible is unbreakable. Well, then we are going to be doing the synopsis because we just unraveled
Are we doing a
Dragon
synopsis?
Song. Remember, this is chapter 2 of Dragon Song. Yeah, I love it.
All right, so we are on Colossians now. We finished Philippians yesterday, and now we are going to read Colossians chapter 1, which I apologize once again. I don't have the link ready to give to you guys, so it is what it is. Sorry, I'm cutting out extra tabs. Okay, so now we're going to get started. All right, Colossians. This is the English Standard Version, as I have always been reading ever since we've been doing this. All right. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. So Timothy co-wrote this book with him. Thank you for the three of you that are online. I appreciate you. So Paul, an apostle, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the saints and faithful brothers in Christ at Colossae. Grace to you and peace from God our Father. Colossae was, I think it was a middle to small town. It wasn't as big as like Ephesus and that kind of thing. And it's right in the middle of Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. Kind of like if you were throwing a dart and you hit the perfect bullseye in that, I think it's kind of right around there, which is a very actually mountainous peninsula. If you've never been there, which I haven't either, but I've seen pictures, there's a lot of mountains. All right, I'll keep going. We always thank God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ when we pray for you, since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love that you have for all the saints, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven. Of this you have heard before in the word of the truth, the gospel, which has come to you, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing. That's a good thing. As it also does among you, since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth, just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant. He is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf and has made known to us your love in the Spirit. And so, from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. I'm going to have to go and just underline that whole paragraph because, wow. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things. Yes, JJ? Okay, good. Start that paragraph over again. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his Christ. And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in Christ's affliction for the sake of his body, that is, the church, of which I became a minister according to the stewardship from God that was given to me for you, to make the word of God fully known. The mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to his saints. To them, God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy that he powerfully works within me. The end of Colossians chapter 1. That is a lot to unpack. So I do want to say one thing. This verse right here, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, has been misinterpreted over the centuries, and people have misinterpreted that to suggest that perhaps Jesus was a created being, which in that case he would not be fully God. And how can that be possible? Because he is fully God, and that is attested all throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament also, really. So anyway, I wish that we had more time to unpack that, but this video is primarily a video about reading. So that's what we're going to do, not a video about theology, but about reading. So here's Daniel, and you've seen JJ crawling around, and I'm not sure if we're doing a synopsis today, but here is Jenny ready to read Dragon Song.
This chair is like, yeah, it's a mess. Okay.
Daniel, what are we
Right.
doing? Okay, hurry.
Chrissy, go away.
Stand on the stairs. Go down.
Okay. Okay, so we're getting a little bit settled on this end. We've got to take some nighttime meds and get people in bed and everything. And the dog needs to go mind her own business. But I'll give the synopsis because Kimberly is getting me some tea. So this book is about a planet called Pern, and it's about a specific character, Meneley. She is the daughter of the leader of a, help me out, Liz, community. And she's been learning under the Harper, and she's been helping take care of the kids, and the Harper passed away, and she sang his death song, and then her father and her mother really don't approve of a female fulfilling this role even temporarily. So this is a girl power book, I'm not gonna lie, but it's duly earned. It's not wallflower-ish anyway. So just you guys have to see this. And this one. I'm being surrounded. Okay. Sorry. All right. Okay, I just can't move. Chapter 2 of Dragon Song. Okay, so Kimmy's not okay. We'll wait a second or two. And Daniel's back. Did the dogs get fed? Yes, you can totally let them out. It's like children. I've never ever left alone. Okay. Okay, so some other things. This is about dragons. The dragons are there to, interestingly enough, in the foreword, I didn't really get to cover this yesterday to give this kind of synopsis, but in the foreword, several generations ago, 5 different groups of dragons and dragon riders went missing. And what happened is the current dragon riders, they were down to one group of dragon riders and dragons. They discovered they could not just like, I don't know what you would call it. What do they call it in the anyway? They can just like blink in between times in between places, and they discovered they can actually do that in between times. So they actually went back in time. JJ, come here. They went back in time and said, hey, you guys want to come help us out because we need more help now because the thread is falling and we don't have enough dragons and dragon riders to make sure that the people don't get burnt to a crisp. And so the thread and the dragons are really important to this story in case you didn't really understand what was happening in the foreword. They made a brief appearance during the Harper's elegy, but they're about to get more into it. So, guys, hurry up! Who's watching? Apparently only one person now, but two people. I saw 6 at one point, and I was like, what? I didn't know we knew that many people. Okay. Do you know what this book's about?
This book is about dragon riders.
Dragon Riders, okay.
This book is about Dragon Song.
Yeah, okay, go lay down. Daniel, you too. Kimmy, can you hear me? You need a shower.
I just took one.
There's something about, go lay down. All right, maybe we'll just skip tonight because I'm not really feeling well and they're not being in control. Go lay down.
Okay.
Chapter 2. Honor those the dragons heed, in thought and favor, word and deed. Words are lost or worlds are saved. From those dangers dragon braved. Dragon men avoid excess, greed will bring the wire distress. To the ancient law adhere, prospers thus the dragon weir. It was easy enough at first for Meneley to forget her tuning during the teachings. She wanted to do Petrion proud so that when the new harper came, he'd find no fault in the children's recitations. The children were attentive. The teaching was always better than gutting and preserving fish, or net mending, or long line baiting. Then, too, winter storms, the severest in many turns, kept the fishing fleet docked, and the teaching eased the boredom. When the fleet was in, Giannis would stop by the little hall where Meneley held her classes. He'd scowl at her from the back of the hall. Fortunately, he'd only stay a little while because he made the children nervous. Once she actually saw his foot tapping the beat. He scowled when he realized what he was doing, and then he left. He had sent the message sloop to Hold 3 days after the burial. The crew brought back news of no interest to Meneley, but the adults went around looking black. Something about the old-timers, and Meneley wasn't to worry her head, so she didn't. The crew also brought back a message slate addressed to Petrion and signed with the imprint of Master Harper Robinson. Poor old Petrion. one of the aunties told Menely, sighing and dabbing affectedly at her eyes. He always looked forward to the slates from Master Harper. Ah, well, it'll keep till the new Harper comes. He'll know what to do with it. It took Menely a while to find out where the slate was. Propped up conspicuously on the mantel in her father's records room, Menely was positive that the message had something to do with her, and the songs that Petrion had said he'd sent to the Master Harper. The notion so obsessed her that she got bold enough to ask her mother why Giannis didn't open the messages. Open a sealed message from the Master Harper to a man dead? Mavi stared at her daughter in shocked incredulity. Love that word. I have lots of incredulous moments being mom. Your father would do no such thing. Harper's letters are for Harper's. I only remembered that Petrion had sent a slate to the Master Harper. I thought it might be about replacement coming. I mean, I'll be glad when the new Harper does come, my girl. You've been getting above yourself with this teaching. The next few days were full of apprehension for Menely. She conceived the idea that her mother would make Giannis replace her as teacher. That was, of course, impossible for the same reason that had forced Giannis to make her the teacher in the first place. But it was a fact that Mavi found all the smelliest, most boring, or tedious jobs for Melanie once her teaching duty was done, and Giannis took it into his head to appear in the little hall more frequently. Then the weather settled down into a clear spell, and the entire sea-hold was kept at a run with fish. The children were excused from the teaching to gather seaweeds blown up by the high tides, and all the hold women set to boiling the weed for the thick juice in the stalks. Juice that kept back many sicknesses and bone ailments, or so the old aunties said, but they'd find good out and any bad the worst of any blessing. And the worst of the seaweed was its smell, thought Melanie, who had to stir the huge kettles. Threadfalls came and added some excitement, the fear in being hold-bound while the dragons swept the skies with their fiery breath, charring thread to impotence. Menely wanted to see that grand sight one day instead of just singing about it or knowing it was taking place outside the thick stone walls and heavy metal shutters of the hold's windows. Afterward, she joined the flamethrower crews that checked for any possible thread that might have escaped dragon flames. Not that there was much for thread to eat on the windswept bare marshes and bogs around Half Circle Seahold. The barren rock palisades that made Half Circle bore no greenery at all, winter or summer, but it was wise to check the marshes and beaches. Thread could burrow into the seagrass stalks or slide down the marshberry and sea beach plum bushes, burrow into the roots, multiply and eat anything green and growing until the coast was as bare as rock. Flame crewing was cold work, but it was a distinct pleasure for Menely to be out of the hold in the rough air. Her team got as far as the dragon stones to the south. Petrion had told her that those stones, standing offshore in the treacherous water, had once been part of the palisade, probably hollowed with caves like all this stretch of cliff. The crowning treat for Melanie was when Weir leader Flar himself, or on Bronze Menelith, circled in for a chat with Giannis. Of course, Menely wasn't near enough to hear what the two men said, but she was close enough to smell the firestone reek of the giant bronze dragon, close enough to see his beautiful eyes catching all the colors in the pale wintry sunlight, to see his muscles knot and smooth under the soft hide. Menely stood, as was properly respectful, with the other flamethrower crews. But once when the dragon turned his head in a lazy fashion to peer in her direction, his eyes whirled slowly with their changing colors, and she was certain that Menmith looked at her. She didn't dare breathe. He was so beautiful. Then suddenly the magic moment was over. Flar gave a graceful leap to the dragon's shoulder, caught the fighting straps, and pulled himself into place on the neck ridges. Air whooshed around Menely and the others as the great bronze opened its fragile-looking wings. The next moment he seemed to be in the air, catching the updraft, beating steadily higher. Abruptly, the dragon winked from view. Menely was not the only one to sigh deeply. To see a dragon rider in the sky was always an occurrence. To be on the same ground with a dragon and his rider, to witness his graceful takeoff and exit between, was a marvel. All the songs about dragon riders and dragons seemed inadequate to Manali. She stole up the little cubicle in the women's dormitory that was shared with Sella. She wanted to be alone. She'd a little pipe among her things, a soft, whispery reed pipe, and she began to play it. A little whistle composed of her excitement and her response to the day's lovely event. So there you are. Sella flounced into the room, her face reddened, her breath rough. She'd obviously run up the steep stairs. Told Mommy you'd be here. Stella grabbed the little pipe from Menelie's fingers. And tuning, too. Oh, Stella, it's an old tune, Melody said. Menda- wow, that's a big word. Mendaciously. David, what does somebody look up what mendaciously means. So, and excuses, and grabbed her pipe back. Stella's jaw worked with anger. Oh, my foot! I knew your ways, girl, and you're dodging work. You get back to the kitchen. You're needed now. I am not dodging work. I taught this morning during Threadfall, and then I had to go with the crews. Your crew's been in this past half day or more, and you still in smelly, sandy clothes, mucking up the room I have to sleep in. You get below, or I'll tell Giannis you've been tuning. Ha! You wouldn't know a tune if you had your nose rubbed in it. But Meneley was shedding her work clothes as fast as she could. Sella was just likely to slip the word to Mavi. Her sister was wary of Giannis as wary of Giannis as Manoli. About Meneley piping in her room, a suspicious action on its own, though Meneley hadn't sworn not to tune at all, only not to do it in front of people. However, everyone was in a good mood that night, Giannis because he'd spoken to Falar, the weir leader, and because there'd be good fishing in the morrow if the weather held. Fish always rose to feed from drowned thread, and half the fall had been over Nerret Bay. The deep would be thick with schools. With Giannis in as good a mood, the rest of the sea holders could also rejoice because there'd been no thread on the ground at all. So it wasn't any wonder that they called on Meneley to play for them. She sang 2 of the longer sagas about dragons and then did the name song for the current wing leaders of Bend and Weir, so her sea hold would know their dragon men. She wondered if they'd been a recent hatching and that Half Circle mightn't have heard about, also being isolated. But she was certain that Falar would have told Giannis if that were so. But would Giannis have told Meneley? She wasn't the harper to be told such things as courtesy. The sea holders wanted more singing, but her throat was tired. So she played them a song they could sing, bellowing out the words in voices roughened by wind and salt. She saw her father scowling at her, though he was singing along with the rest of them, and she wondered if he didn't want her, a mere girl, to play men's songs. It galled her because she'd played them often enough when Petrian was alive. She sighed at this injustice, and then wondered what Falar would have said if he'd known that Half Circle Seahold was dependent on a mere girl for their harping. She'd heard everyone say that Falar was a fair man, a far-seeing man, and a fine dragon rider. There was even songs about him and his weir-woman, Lessa. So she sang them in honor of the weir leader's visit, and her father's expression lightened. She sang on until her throat was so tight that not a squeak would come out. She wished that someone else could play to give her a rest, but as she scanned the faces of the holders, there wasn't any of them who could beat a drum properly, much less finger a guitar or pipe. That was why the next day it seemed only logical for her to start one of the children learning the drum rolls. Plenty of songs could be sung just to drum beat, and one of Sorel's 2 children still in teaching was sensitive enough to learn the pipe. Someone, Sella perhaps, Meneley thought bitterly, informed Mavi of Meneley's activity. You were told no tuning. Teaching someone drum beats is not tuning. Teaching anyone to play in is harper business, not yours, my girl. Just your good fortune sea holder is out in the deep, or you'd have the belt across your shoulders, so you would. No more nonsense. But it's not nonsense, Mavi. Last night another drummer or piper would have. Her mother raised her hand in warning, and mentally bit shut her lips. No tuning, Menely. And that was that. Now, girl, see to the clothes before the fleet gets back. That job took Menely inexorably to the Harper's room, swept clean of everything that had been personal to Petrion. She was also reminded of the sealed message on the record room mantel. What if the Master Harper was expecting a message from Petrion about the songmaker? Menely was so very sure that part of that unopened message was about her. Not that thinking about it did Menely any good, even knowing it for a fact would be no help. Menely decided gloomily, but she didn't stop her from that didn't stop her from going past Giannis's record room and peering in at the tempting package on the mantel. She sighed, turning from the room. By now, the Master Harper would have heard of Petrion's death and be sending a new Harper. Maybe the new man would be able to open the message, and maybe if it was about her, maybe if it said that the songs she'd sent were good ones, Giannis and her mother wouldn't put such restrictions on her about tuning and whistling and everything. As the winter spun itself out, Menely found that her sense of loss when she thought of Petrion deepened. She had been the only person, or he had been the only person in the Seahold who had ever encouraged her in anything, and most especially in that one thing that she was now forbidden to do. Melodies don't stop growing in the mind, tapping at fingers just because they're forbidden, and Menely didn't stop composing them, which she felt was not precisely disobeying. What seemed to worry Giannis and Mavi most, mentally reasoned to herself, was the fact that the children, whom she was supposed to teach only the proper ballads and sagas, might think Menely's tunes were Harper crafted. If her tunes were that good in her parents' ears, what was the harm of them? Basically, they didn't want her to play her songs aloud, where they would be heard and perhaps repeated at awkward times. Menely could, therefore, see no harm in writing down new tunes. She played them softly in the empty little hall when the children had left, before she began her afternoon chores, carefully hiding her notations among the Harper records in the rack of the hall, safe enough for no one but herself till the new Harper came would ever discover them there. This mild deviation from the absolute obedience to her father's restriction about tuning, I am not advocating disobedience to your father. Did you hear that? Okay. This mild deviation from the absolute obedience to her father's restriction about tuning did much to ease Menely's growing frustration and loneliness. What Menely didn't realize was that her mother had been watching her closely, having recognized the signs of rebellion in her. Mavi didn't want the hold to be disgraced in any way, and she feared that Menely, her head turned by Petrion's marked favor, was not mature enough to discipline herself. Stella had warned her mother that Menely was getting out of hand. Mavi put some of that tale down to sisterly envy, but when Stella had told Mavi that Menely had actually started to teach another how to play an instrument, Mavi had been obliged to intervene. Let Giannis get one whisper of Menely's disobedience, and there'd be real trouble in the hold for the girl. Spring was coming, and with spring, the quieter seas. Perhaps the new Harper would arrive soon. And then spring did come, a first glorious day. The sweet scents of sea beach plum and marshberry filled the seaward breezes and came in through the open shutters of the little hall. The children were singing loudly, as if shouting got them through the learning faster. True, they were singing one of the longer sagas, word perfect, but with far more exuberance than was strictly needed. Perhaps it was that exuberance that infected Menely and reminded her of a tune she'd tried to set down the day before. She did not consciously disobey. She certainly was unaware that the fleet had returned from an early catch. She was equally unaware that the chords she was strumming were not officially of the Harper's craft. And it was doubly unfortunate that this lapse occurred just as C. Holder passed the open windows of the hall. He was in the little hall almost at once, summarily dismissing the youngsters to help unload the heavy catch. Then he silently, which made the anticipation of the punishment worse, removed his wide belt, signaled to Melanie to raise her tunic over her head and to bend over the high Harper's stool. When he had finished, she had fallen to her knees on the hard stone flags. biting her lips to keep back the sobs. He'd never beaten her so hard before. The blood was roaring in her ears so fiercely that she didn't hear Giannis leave the little hall. It was a long while before she could ease the tunic over the painful whelps on her back. Only when she got very slowly to her feet did she realize that he'd taken the guitar too. She knew then that his judgment was irrevocable and harsh. And unjust. She'd only played the first few bars, hummed along, and that only because the last chords of the teaching ballad had modified into the new tune in her head. Surely the little snitch wouldn't have done any lasting harm. And the children knew all the teaching ballads they were supposed to know. She hadn't meant to disobey Giannis. Mentally, her mother came to the class hall door and carrying thong of an empty skin in her hand. You dismissed them early? Is that wise? Her mother stopped abruptly and stared at her daughter. An expression of anger and disgust crossed her face. So you've been the fool after all, with so much at stake, and you had to tune. I didn't do it on purpose, Mavi. The song came into my mind. I'd played no more than a measure. There wasn't any point in trying to justify the incident to her mother. Not now. The desolation Mentally had felt when she realized her father had taken the guitar intensified in the face of her mother's cold displeasure. Take the sack. We need fresh greens, Mavi said in an expressionless voice, and any of the yellow-veined grass that might be up. There should be some. Resignedly, Manoli took the sack and, without thinking, looped the thong over her shoulder. She caught her breath as the unwieldy sack banged against her scored back. Before Mentally could avoid it, her mother had flipped up the loose tunic. She gave an inarticulate exclamation. You'll need numbweed on some of those. Mentally pulled away. What good's a beating then if it's numbed away first chance? And she dashed out the hall. Do you all understand what just happened?
On her back.
She got Yes, she got spanked on her back with a belt, but it was not like a spanking, like a normal spanking. It was a beating. It was like with a belt, and it actually ripped up her back pretty bad. Okay.
And her mom doesn't even care.
Yes, and her mom doesn't care. Kind of like Mara. Yeah, that's true. That's what Daddy just said. All right. Before Mentally could avoid it, her mother had flipped up the loose tunic. She gave an inarticulate exclamation. You'll need numbweed on some of those. Mentally pulled away. What good's a beating then if it's numbed away first chance? And she dashed out of the hall. Much Mavi cared if she hurt anyhow, except that a sound body works harder and longer and faster. Her thoughts and her misery spurred her out of the hold, every swinging stride she took jarring her sore back. She didn't slow down because she'd the whole long track in front of the hold to go. The faster she went, the better. Before some auntie wanted to know why the children were out of lessons so soon, or why Mentally was going green picking instead of teaching. Fortunately, she encountered no one. Everyone was either down at the dock cave unloading or making themselves scarce to the sea holders' eyes so they wouldn't have to. Mentally charged past the smaller holds, down a ways on the marsh road, then up the right-hand track south of the half circle. She'd put as much distance between herself and sea hold as she could, all perfectly legitimate in search of greenery. As she jogged along the sandy footpath, she kept her eyes open for fresh growth, trying to ignore the occasional rough going when she'd jar her whole body. Her back began to smart. She gritted her teeth and paced on. Her brother, Alamai, had once said that she could run as well as any boy of the hold and outdistance the half of them on a long race. If only she had been a boy, then it wouldn't have mattered if Petrion had died and left them harperless. Nor would Giannis have beaten a boy for being brave enough to sing his own songs. The first of the low marsh valleys was pink and yellow, with blooming sea beach plum and marshberries, slightly blackened here and there, more from the low-flying queens catching the odd thread that escaped the main wings. Yes, and there was the patch with the flamethrower that had charred, the one thread infestation that had gotten through. One day, Meneley told herself she'd just throw open a window's steel shutters and see the dragons charring thread in the sky. What a sight that must be, for certain. Fearful, too, she reckoned, having seen her mother treat men for threadburn. Why, the mark looked as if someone had drawn a point-deep groove with a red-hot poker on the man's arm, leaving the edges black with singed skin. Torley would always bear that straight scar, puckered and red, thread score, never healed neatly. She had to stop running. She'd begun to sweat heavily and her back was stinging. She loosened her tunic belt, flapping the soft runner beast hide to send cooling draughts up between her shoulder blades. Past the first marsh valley, up over the rocky hump hill into the next valley, cautious going here. This was one of the deep boggy places. No sign of yellow-veined grasses. There had been a stand last summer, 2 humpy hills over. She heard them first, glancing up with a stab of terror at the unexpected sound above. Dragons? She glanced wildly about her for the telltale gray glitter of sky-born thread in the east. The greeny-blue sky was clear of that dreaded fogging, but not of dragon wings. She heard dragons? It couldn't be. They didn't swarm like that. Dragons always flew in ordered wings, a pattern against the sky. These were darting, dodging, then swooping and climbing. She shaded her eyes. Blue flashes, green, and the odd brown, and then, of course, sun glinted golden off the leading, dart-like body. A queen. A queen that tiny? She expelled the breath she'd been holding in her amazement. A fire lizard queen? It had to be. Only fire lizards could be that small and look like dragons. Weirs certainly didn't. And Weirs didn't mate midair, and that's what Meneley was seeing, the mating flight of a fire lizard queen with her bronzes in close pursuit. So fire lizards weren't boy talk. Awed, Meneley watched the swift, graceful flight. The queen had led her swarm so high that the smaller ones, the blues and the greens and browns, had been forced down. They circled now at a lower altitude, struggling to keep the same direction as their high flyers. They dipped and dashed in mimicry of the queen in bronzes. They had to be fire lizards, thought Melanie, her heart almost stopping at the beauty and thrill of the sight. Fire lizards. And they were like dragons, only much, much smaller. She didn't know all the teachings for nothing. A queen dragon was gold. She mated with the bronze, who could outfly her, which was exactly what was happening right now with the fire lizards. Oh, they were beautiful to behold. The queen had turned sunward, and Meneley, for all her eyes were very long-sighted, could barely pick out that black mote and trailing cluster. She walked on, following the main group of fire lizards. She'd bet anything that she'd end up at the coast near the Dragonstones. Last fall, her brother Alamai had climbed. He'd seen fire lizards there at dawn, feeding on fingertails in the shallows. His report had set off another rash of what Petrion had called lizard fever. Every lad in the Sea-Hold had burned with plans to trap a fire lizard. They'd plagued Alamai to repeat his sighting. It was just as well that the Craigs were unapproachable. Not even an experienced boatman would brave the treacherous currents. But if anyone had been sure there were fire lizards there, well, no one would know from her. Even if Petrion had been alive, Meneley decided, she would not have told him. He'd never seen a fire lizard, though. He'd admitted to the children that the records allowed that fire lizards did exist. They're seen, Petrion had told her later, but they can't be captured. He gave a wheezing chuckle. People, sorry, my screen just went weird. People have been trying to since the first shell was cracked. Why can't they be caught? They don't want to. They're smart. They just disappear. They go between like dragons. There is no proof of that, said Petrion, a trifle cross, as if she'd been too presumptuous in suggesting a comparison between the fire lizards and the great dragons of Pern. Where else can you disappear to? Meneley had wanted to know. What is between? Someplace that isn't, Petrion had shuddered. You're never here nor there, and he gestured first to one corner of the hall and then towards the sea dock on the other side of the harbor. It's cold and it's nothing. No sight, no sound, no sensations. You've ridden Dragonback? Meneley had been impressed. Once, many turns ago. He shuddered again in remembrance. Now, since we're touching on the subject, sing me the riddle song. It's been solved. Why do we have to know it now? Sing it for me so I'll know that you know it, girl, Petrion had said testily, which was no reason at all. But Petrion had been very kind to her, Meneley knew, and her throat tightened with remembered regret for his passing. Had he gone between, the way dragons did when they lost their riders or grew too infirm to fly? No, no one left, no, one left nothing behind, going between. Petrion had left his body to be slipped into the deeps, and Petrion had left more behind than his body. He'd left her every song he'd ever known, every lay, every ballad, saga, every fingering, chord, and strum, every rhythm. There wasn't any way a stringed instrument could be played that she didn't know, nor any cadence on the drums. Chrissy! I know what happened. So my screen, I used to be able to see myself, and I accidentally dropped the mouse like when we started. And the dog has come back, and she's laying on the mouse, and it's clicking itself to pieces. So hold on a minute. Oh, now everything's gone. Help, honey. I don't know.
Where's the mouse?
Okay.
Nope.
I was wondering what happened. I swear these dogs are like attached to my ankles.
Chrissy, move. Go.
And I'm a cat
Go, go, go.
person, so okay. There wasn't any stringed instrument could be played that she didn't know, nor any cadence on the drums at which she wasn't time perfect. She could whistle double trills as well as any wiry with her tongue on her reeds. But there had been some things Petrion wouldn't, or perhaps couldn't, tell her about her world. Meneley wondered if this was because she was a girl and there were mysteries that only the male mind could understand. Well, as Mavi had once told Meneley and Sella, there are feminine puzzles that no mere man could sort, so that score is even. And one more for the feminine side, said Meneley as she followed the fire lizards. A mere girl had seen what all the boys and men of the Sea-Hold had only dreamed of seeing, fire lizards at play. They'd ceased following the queen and her bronzes and now indulged in mock air battles, swooping now and then to the land itself and seemingly under it, until Meneley realized that they must be over the beaches. The sand was slipping under her feet. An unwary step could plunge her into the holes and dips. She could hear the sea. She changed her course, keeping to the thicker patches of coarse marsh grasses. The ground would be firmer there, and she'd be less visible to the fire lizards. She came to a slight rise before the bluff broke off into a steep dive into the beaches. The dragon stones were beyond in the sea, slightly hidden by a heat haze. Did you send your cat after me? She's right swinging through my legs. Okay. She could hear the fire lizards chirping and chattering. She crouched in the grasses and then, dropping to her full length, crept to the bluff edge, hoping for another glimpse of the fire lizards. They were quite visible, delightfully so. The tide was out, and they were exceedingly busy on the shallows, picking rock mites from the tumbled, exposed boulders, or wallowing on the narrow edging of red and white sand, bathing themselves with great enthusiasm in the little pools, spreading their delicate wings to dry. There were several. How do you do this? Several flurries as two large lizards vied for the same choice morsel. In that alone, she decided, they must differ from dragons. She'd never heard of dragons fighting amongst themselves for anything. She'd heard that dragons feeding among herds of runner beasts and wires were something horrible to behold. Dragons didn't eat that frequently, which was as well, or not all the resources of Pern could keep the dragons fed. Did dragons like fish? Mentally giggled, wondering if there were any fish in the sea big enough to satisfy a dragon's appetite. Probably those legendary fish that always eluded the sea holders' nets. Her sea holds sent their tithe of sea produce, salted, pickled, or smoked, to the Bendenweir. Occasionally, a dragon rider came asking for fresh fish for a special feasting, like a hatching, and the women of the Wire came every spring and fall to berry or cut withies and grasses. Menelly had once served Menora, the head woman of Bendon Lower Caverns, and a very pleasant, gentle woman she'd been too. Menelly hadn't been allowed to stay in the room long because Mavi shooed her daughters out, saying that she had things to discuss with Menora. But Menelly had seen enough to know she liked her. The whole flock of lizards suddenly went aloft, startled by the return of the queen and the bronze who had flown her. The pair settled wearily on the warm, shallow waters, wings spread as if both were too exhausted to fold them back. The bronze tenderly twined his neck about his queen's, and they floated so, while Blues excitedly offered the resting pair fingertellas and rock mites. Entranced, Mentally watched from her screen of sea grass, she was utterly engrossed by the small doings of eating, cleaning, and resting. By and by, singly or in pairs, the lesser fire lizards winged up to the first of the sea surrounded bluffs, lost quickly from Menelly's sight as they secreted themselves in tiny creviced weirs. With graceful dignity, the queen and her bronze rose from their bathing. How they managed to fly with their glistening wings so close together, Menelly didn't know. As one, they seemed to dart aloft, then glide in a slow spiral down to the dragon stones, disappearing on the seaside and out of Menelly's vision. Only then did she become conscious of discomfort, of the hot sun on her welted back, sand in the waistband of her trousers, seeping into her shoes, dried as sweaty grit on her face and hands. Cautiously she wiggled back from the edge of the bluff. If the fire lizards knew they'd been overseen, they might not return to this cove. When she felt she'd crawled far enough, she got to a crouching position and ran for a way. She felt as rarely privileged as if she'd been asked to bend and wear. She kicked up her heels in an excess of joy, and then, spotting some thick marsh grass canes in the bogs, snicked one off at the waterline. Her father may have taken her guitar away, but there were more materials than strings over a sounding box to make music. She measured the proper length barrel and cut off the rest. She deftly made 6 holes, top and 2 bottom, as Petrion had taught her, and in moments she was playing her reed pipe, a saucy tune, bright and gay because she was happy inside, a tune about a little fire lizard queen sitting on a rock in a lapping sea, preening herself for her adoring bronze. She'd a bit of trouble with the obligatory runs and found herself changing keys, but when she'd rehearsed the tune several times, she decided she liked it. It sounded so different from the sort of melody Petrion had taught her, different from the traditional form. Furthermore, it sounded like a fire lizard song, sprightly, cunning, secretive. She stopped her piping, puzzled. Did the dragons know about fire lizards? Okay, chapter 3. We have been reading for 48 minutes and 35 seconds. So, chapter 3 is probably really long. It's really long. Oof. Okay, chapter is 12 pages long. 13 pages long. So, I see that there are 3 people watching right now, and I just want to know if you guys really want me to go on, I can go on. But let me know in the comments if you are good for tonight or if you want me to go on. JJ, are you awake? I think JJ's asleep again. Daniel, are you awake? Daniel's awake. Kimmy's awake. I don't know who's watching. I think maybe Granny Bear. I don't know. I can't see the comments. What do you think? Should we go on? All right. Because it's really starting to get good. Chapter 3. Hold her watch. Hold her learn. Something new in every turn. Oldest, maybe coldest too. Sense the right, find the true. When Meneley finally got back to the sea hole, the sky was darkening. The hall was bustling with the usual end of day activity. The oldsters were setting the dinner tables, tidying the great hall, and chattering away as if they hadn't met for turns instead of only that morning. With luck, thought Meneley, she could get her sack down to the water rooms. Where did you go for those greens, Meneley? Nerat? Her mother appeared in front of her. Almost. Immediately, Meneley saw that her pert words were ill-timed. Mavi roughly grabbed the sack and peered inside critically. If you'd not made the trip worth the while, sail's been sighted. Sail? Mavi closed the sack and shoved it back into Meneley's hands. Yes, sail. You should have been back hours ago. Whatever possessed you to take off so far with thread? There weren't any greens nearer. With thread due to fall any time, you're a fool twice over. I was safe enough. I saw a dragon rider doing his sweep. That pleased Mavi. Thank heavens we're beholden to Bendon. They're a proper wear. Mavi gave her daughter a shove towards the kitchen level. Take those, and be sure the girls wash every speck of sand off. Who knows who's sailing in? Mentally slipped through the busy kitchen, countering orders flung at her by various other women who saw her in her a capable assistant at their own tasks. Mentally merely brandished the sack and proceeded down to the water rooms. There, some of the older but still able women were busily sand scouring the best metal plates and trays. I must have one basin for the greens, Auntie, said Mentally, pushing up to the rank of stone sinks. Greens is easier on old skin than sand, said one of the women in a quavering, long-suffering voice, and promptly deposited her pile of plates into the sink beside her and pulled her plug. More sand in the greens than clearing, another woman remarked in an acid tone. Yes, but take it off, Greens, said the obliging one. Oh, what a lovely mess of yellow veins, too. Where did you find them this time of year, daughter? Halfway to Narat, mentally suppressed her grin at their startled shrieks of dismay. The furthest they'd stir from the hold was the ledge in front on a sunny day. With thread falling? You naughty girl! Did you hear about the sale? Who do you suppose? The new harper. Who else? There was a wild chorus of cackling laughs and great wonderings about the appearance of the new harper. They always send a young one here. Petrion was old. He got that way, same as we did. I love the old aunties. How would you remember? Why not? I've lived through more harpers than you have, my girl. You have not. I came here from Red Sands in Ista. You were born at Half Circle, you old fool, and I birthed you. Ha! Mentally listened to the four old women arguing back and forth until she heard her mother demanding to know if the greens had been washed. And where were the good plates, and how was she to get anything done with all the gossip? Mentally found a sieve large enough to hold the washed greens and brought them up for her mother's inspection. Well, that'll be enough for the head table, Mavi said, poking at the glistening mound with her fork. Then she stared at her daughter. You can't appear like that. Here, you, Barty, take the greens and put the dressing on them. The one in the brown flask on the fourth shelf in the cool room. You, Mentally, have the goodness to get yourself sand-free and decently dressed. You're to attend old uncle. The moment he opens his mouth, shove something into it, or we'll be hearing him all night long. Mentally groaned. Old uncle smelled almost as much as he chattered. Stella's much better at handling him, Mavi. If Stella's to attend the head table, you do as you're told and be grateful. Mavi fixed her rebellious daughter with a stern eye, tacitly reminding her of her disgrace. Then Mavi was called away to check on a sauce for the baking fish. Mentally went off to the bathing suites. Turning to convince herself that she was lucky and hadn't been banished completely from the hall this evening, though tending old uncle came as close to be as banishment. Honor obliged the seaholder to have all his household there to greet the new harper. Mentally shucked off the dirty tunic and breeches and slipped into the warm bathing pool. She swung her shoulders this way and that for the water to wash the sand and sweat as painlessly as possible from her sore back. Her hair was all gritty with sand, sea sand, too, so she washed that. She was quick because she'd have her hands full with old uncle. It'd be much better to have him all arranged in his hearth seat before everyone else assembled for dinner. Draping her dirty clothes around her, mentally took the calculated risk that few people would be in the high hold at this hour and charged up the dimly lit steps from the bathing pools to the sleeping level. Every glow in the main corridor was uncovered, which meant that the Harper, if such it were, would have a guided tour of the hold later. She dashed down to the narrow steps leading to the girls' dormitories and got into a cubicle without a soul the wiser. So she just ran from the bathroom to her bedroom naked with her clothes draped around her. Draping her dirty clothes around her. Oh, wait, I just did that. Okay. When she got to old Uncle's room later, she had to clean his face and hands and slip a clean tunic over her bony shoulders. All the while, she was chattering about new blood in the hold, and he who was the new Harper going to marry. He'd a thing or two to tell the Harper, give him the chance, and why did she have to be so rough? His bones ached. Must be a change in the weather because his old legs never failed to give warning. Hadn't he warned them about the big storm a while back? 2 boats had been lost with all the crew, and if they'd paid any attention to his warning, it wouldn't have happened. His own son was the worst one for not listening to what his father said. And why was she hurrying him so? He liked to take his time. No, couldn't he have the blue tunic? The one his daughter had made him? Matching his eyes, she'd said. And why hadn't Turlon come to see him today as he'd as he'd asked and asked and asked, but who paid him any heed anymore? The old man was so frail that he was no burden to a strong girl like Meneley. She carried him down the steps. He complained all the way about people who'd been dead before she was born. Old Uncle's notion of time was distorted. That's what Petrion had told her. Brightest in Uncle's memory were his earlier days when he'd been sea holder of Half Circle before a tangled trawler line had sliced off his legs below the knee. The great hall was almost ready for guests when Meneley entered with him. They're tacking into dock, someone was saying as Meneley arranged old Uncle in his special seat by the fire. She wrapped him well in the softened weir hides and tied the strap that would keep him upright. When he got excited, old Uncle had a tendency to forget he had no feet. Who's tacking into dock? Who's coming? What's all the hubbub about? Meneley told him, and he subsided moments later, wanting to know in a querulous tone of voice if anyone was going to feed him, or was he supposed to sit there dinnerless? Sella, in the gown she'd spent all winter making, swirled past Meneley, pressing a small packet into her hand. Feed him these if he gets difficult, and she skimmed away before Meneley could say a word. Opening the packet, Meneley saw balls of sweet made from seaweed flavored with purple grass seed. One could chew these for hours, keeping the mouth fresh and moist. Small wonder Sella had been able to keep old Uncle happy. Meneley giggled and then wondered why Sella was being so helpful. It must have pleased Sella no end to learn Meneley had been displaced as Harper. Or would she know? Mavi wouldn't have mentioned it, but the Harper was here now, anyhow. Now that she had old Uncle settled, Meneley's curiosity got the better of her, and she slipped over to the windows. There was no sign of the sail in the harbor now, but she could see the cluster of men, glows held high as they walked around the shore from the dock to the hold proper. Keen though her eyes were, Meneley could not pick out the new faces, and that was that. Old Uncle began one of his monologues in a high-pitched voice, so Meneley scooted back to his side before her mother could notice she'd left her post. There was so much bustle, putting food on the tables, pouring the welcoming cups of wine, all the hold arranging itself to meet the guests, no one noticed what Meneley was or wasn't doing. Just then old Uncle came to himself again, eyes bright and focused on her face. "What's the stir today, girl? Good haul? Someone getting spliced? What's the lay?" "There's a new Harper coming, everyone thinks, old Uncle." "Not another one!" Old Uncle was disgusted. "Harpers ain't what they used to be when I was seaholder, not by a long crack. I mind myself one Harper we had." His voice fell clearly on the suddenly quiet hall. "Meneley!" Her mother's voice was low, but the urgency was unmistakable. Meneley fumbled in her skirt pocket, found 2 sweet balls, and popped them into old Uncle's mouth. Whatever he'd been about to say was stopped by the necessity of dealing with 2 large round objects. He mumbled contentedly to himself as he chewed and chewed and chewed. All the food had been served, and everyone seated before Meneley got so much as a glimpse of the new arrivals. There had been a new Harper. She heard his name before she ever saw his face, Elgion, Harper Elgion. She heard that he was young and good-looking and had brought 2 guitars, 2 wooden pipes, and 3 drums, each carried separately in its own case of stiffened weirhide. She heard that he'd been seasick across Kirun Bay and wasn't doing justice to the lavish dinner spread in his honor. With him had come a craft-master from Smithcraft Hall to do the metal work required of the new ship and other repairs beyond the middleman in the sea hold. She heard that there was urgent need at Eigen Hold for any salted or smoked fish the sea hold might have to spare on the return voyage. From where Meneley sat with old Uncle, she could see the backs of heads at the high table and occasionally a profile of one of the visitors. Very frustratingly so was old Uncle and the other elderly relatives whose old bones rated them a spot near the fire. The aunts were, as usual, squabbling over who had received the choicer portions of fish, and then old Uncle decided to call them to order, only his mouth was full at that moment and he choked. So the aunts turned to Meneley, who, trying to stuff him out, to stuff him to an early death. Meneley could hear nothing over their babble. She tried to content herself with the prospect of hearing the Harper sing, as he surely would, once the interminable meal was ended. But it was hot so close to the big fire, and the heat made old Uncle smell worse than ever, and she was very tired after the day's exertions. She was roused from a half doze by a sudden hall-wide thudding of heavy sea boots. She jerked fully awake to see the tall figure of the new Harper rising at the head table. He had his guitar ready and was taking an easy stance, 1 foot on the stone bench. "You're sure this hall isn't rocking?" he said, strumming a few chords to test the instrument's pitch. He was assured that the hall had been steady for many, many turns. Never known to rock at all. The Harper affected not to be reassured as he turned the G string slightly higher to Meneley's relief. Means she's pitch perfect and he was tuning. He made the guitar moan then like a seasick soul. As laughter rippled through the eager audience, Meneley strained to see how her father was taking this approach. The sea holder had little humor. A Harper's welcome was a serious occasion, and Elgion did not appear to realize this. Petryon had often told Meneley how carefully Harpers were chosen for the hold they were assigned to. Hadn't anyone warned Elgion about her father's temperament? Suddenly, old Uncle cut across the gentle strumming with a cackle of laughter. "Ha! A man with humor! That's what we need in this hold. Some laughter, some music. Been missing it. Let's have some rollicking tunes, some funny songs. Give us a good rib-popping ditty, Harper. You know the ones I like." Meneley was aghast. She fumbled in her skirt pocket for some of the sweet balls as she shushed old Uncle. This was exactly the sort of incident that she was supposed to prevent. Harper Elgion had turned at the imperious order, bowing with good respect to the old gentleman by the hearth. "I would that I could, old Uncle," he said most courteously, "but these are serious times," and his fingers plucked deep, somber notes. "Very serious times, and we must put lightness and laughter behind us. Square our backs to the problems that face us." And with that, he swung into a new exhortation to obey the wire and honor the dragon rider. The sticky sweet balls had got warmed and stuck to the fabric of her pocket, but Meneley finally got some out and into old Uncle's mouth. He chewed angrily, fully aware that his mouth was being plugged and resenting it. He chewed as fast as he could, swallowing to clear his mouth from more complaints. Meneley was only just aware that the new tune was forceful, the words stirring. Harper Elgion had a rich tenor voice, strong and sure. Then old Uncle began to hiccup, noisily, of course, and to complain or try to through the hiccups. Meneley hissed at him and to hold his breath, but he was furious at not being allowed to talk, at getting hiccups, and he started to pound the arm of his chair. The thumps made an out-of-tempo counterpoint to the Harper's song and brought her furious glances from the head table. One of the aunts gave her some water for the old man, which he overturned on Melanie. The next thing, Stella was beside her, gesturing that they were to take the old man back to his quarters instantly. He was still hiccuping as they put him back to bed and still beating the air with punctuated gestures and half-uttered complaints. You'll have to stay with him until he calms down mentally, or he'll fall out of bed. Why ever didn't you give him the sweet balls? They always shut him up, Stella said. I did. They're what started him hiccuping. You can't do anything right, can you? Please, Stella, you stay with him. You manage him so well. I've had him all evening and not heard a word. You were told to keep him quiet. You didn't. You stay, said Stella as she swept out of the room, leaving Meneley to cope with. That was the end of the first of Meneley's difficult days. It took hours for the old man to calm down and go to sleep. Then, as Meneley wearily got to her cubicle, her mother arrived to berate her soundly for the inattention that had given Uncle a chance to embarrass the entire hold. Meneley was given no chance to explain. The next day, thread fell, sequestering them all within the hold for hours. When the fall was over, she had to go with a flamethrower cruise. The leading edge of the thread had tipped the marshes, which meant hours of plodding through sticky marsh mud and slimy sand. She was tired enough when she returned from that task, but then they all had to help load the big nets and ready the boats for a night trawl. The tide was right then. She was roused before sunrise the next morning to gut and salt the phenomenal catch. Okay. That took all the livelong day and sent her to bed so weary she just stripped off her dirty clothes and dropped into her sleeping furs. The next day was devoted to net mending, normally a pleasant task because the hold women would chat and sing, but her father was anxious for the nets to be repaired quickly so that he could take the evening tide again for another deep sea cast. Everyone bent to his work without time for talk or singing while the sea holder prowled among them. He seemed to watch Meneley more often than anyone else, and she felt clumsy. It was then that she began to wonder if perhaps the new harper had found fault with the way the youngsters had been taught their ballads and sagas. Time and again, Petron had told her that was only one way to teach them, and as she had learned properly from him, she must have passed on the knowledge correctly. Why then did her father seem to be so annoyed with her? Why did he glare at her so much? Was he still angry with her for letting old uncle babble? She worried enough to ask her sister about it that evening when the ships had finally set sail and everyone else could relax a little. Angry about old uncle? Stella shrugged. What on earth are you talking about, girl? Who remembers that? You think entirely too much of yourself, Melanie. That's your biggest problem. Why should Giannis care one way or another about you? Thanks, sis. The scorn in Stella's voice reminded Meneley too acutely that she was only a girl, too big for a proper girl, and the youngest of a large family, therefore of least account. It was in no way a consolation to be insignificant, even if her father was, for that reason, less likely to notice her or remember her misdeeds, except that he'd remembered about her singing her own songs to the youngsters. Or had Stella forgotten that? Or did Stella even know that? Probably, thought Meneley as she tried to find a comfortable spot on the old bed rushes for her weary body. But then, what Stella said about Meneley thinking only of herself applied even more to Stella, who was always thinking about her appearance and herself. Stella was old enough to be married to some advantage to the hold. Her father had only 3 fosterlings at the moment, but 4 of Meneley's 6 brothers were out at the other sea holds learning their trade. Now, with a harper to speak for them all again, perhaps there'd be some rearrangements. The next day the hold women spent in washing clothes. With Threadfall past and a good clear sunny day, they could count on fast drying. Meneley hoped for a chance to speak to her mother to find out if the harper had faulted her teaching, but the opportunity never arose. Instead, Meneley came in for another scolding from Mavi for the state of her clothes, unmended, her bed furs unaired, her hair, her sloppy appearance, and her slothfulness in general. That evening, that means clean your room and do your laundry. That evening, Meneley was quite content to take a bowl of soup and disappear into a shadowy corner of the big kitchen rather than be noticed again. She kept wondering why she was being singled out for so much misunderstanding. Her thoughts kept returning to the sin of having strummed a few bars on her own song. That, and being a girl and only one who could teach or play in the absence of a real harper. Yes, she finally decided that was the reason for her universal disfavor. No one wanted the harper to know that the youngsters had been schooled by a girl, but if she hadn't taught them right, then Petrion had taught her all wrong. That didn't hold water. And if the old man had really written the master harper about her, wouldn't the new harper have been curious or sought her out? Maybe her songs hadn't been as good as old Petrion had thought. Probably Petrion had never sent them to the master harper, and that message hadn't said anything about her. At any rate, the package was now gone from the mantel in the records room, and the way things were going, Menely would never get close enough to Elgion to introduce herself. Sure as the sun came up, Menely could guess what she'd have to do the next day: gather new grasses and rushes to repack all the beds in the hold. It was just the sort of thing her mother would think of for someone so out of favor. She was wrong. The ships came back to port just after dawn, their holds packed with yellow stripe and pack-tails. The entire hold was turned out to gut, salt, and start the smoke cave. Of all the fish in the sea, Menely detested pack-tails the most. An ugly fish with sharp spines all over it oozed, an oily slime that ate into the flesh of your hands and made the skin peel off. Pack-tails were more head and mouth than anything else, but hack the front end off and the rounded blunt tail could be sliced off off the backbone. Grilled fresh, it was succulent eating. Smoked, it could be softened later for baking or boiling and be as tasty as the day it was caught. But packtails were the messiest, hardest, toughest, smelliest fish to gut. Halfway through the morning, Melanie's knife slipped across the fish she was slicing, gashing her left palm wide open. The pain and shock were so great that Melanie just stood stupidly staring at her hand bones until Sella realized that she wasn't keeping pace with the others. Melanie, just dreaming. Oh, for the love of Mavi, Mavi! Sella could be irritating, but she could keep her wits, as she did now, grabbing Melanie's wrist and stopping the spurt of blood from the severed artery. As Mavi came and led her past the furiously working holders, Melanie was seized with a sense of guilt. Everyone glared at her as if she'd deliberately wounded herself to get out of working. The humiliation and silent accusations brought tears to her eyes, not the pain or the sick feeling in her hand. I didn't do it on purpose, mentally blurted out to her mother as she reached the Holds infirmary. Her mother stared at her. Who said that you did? No one. They just looked at. My girl, you think entirely too much about yourself. I assure you that no one was thinking you did any such thing. Now hold your hand so for a moment. The blood spurted up as Navi released the pressure on the tendon in Melanie's wrist. For one instant, Melanie thought she might faint, but she was determined not to think of herself again. She pretended that she didn't own the hand that Mavi was going to have to fix. Mavi now deftly fastened a tourniquet and then laved the wound with a pungent herbal lotion. Menelie's hand began to numb, increasing her detachment from the injury. The bleeding ceased, but somehow Menelie couldn't bring herself to look into the wound. Instead, she watched the intent expression on her mother's face as she quickly stitched the severed blood vessel and closed the long slice. Then she slathered quantities of salve on the cut and bound the hand in soft cloths. There, let's hope it got all the packtail slime out of the wound. Concern and doubt caused Mavi to frown, and Menelie became fearful. Suddenly she remembered other things, women losing fingers, and my hand. Will it be all right, won't it? We'll hope so. Mavi never lied, and the small hard ball of sick fear began to unknot in Melanie's stomach. You should have some use of it, enough for all practical purposes. What do you mean, practical purposes? Won't I be able to play again? Play? Mavi gave her daughter a long, hard stare, as if she'd mentioned something forbidden. Your playing days are over, Menelie. You're way past the teaching. But the new harper has new songs. The ballad he sang last night. I never heard all of it. I don't know the chording. I want to learn. She broke off. horribly frightened by the closed look on her mother's face and the shine of pity in her eyes. Even if your fingers will work after that slice, you won't be playing again. Content yourself that Giannis was so indulgent while old Petrion was dying. But Petrion, that's enough buts. Here, drink this. I want you in your bed before it puts you to sleep. You've lost a lot of blood, and I can't have you fainting away on me. Stunned by her mother's words, Emily barely tasted the bitter wine and weed. She stumbled, even with her mother's help, up the stone steps to her cubicle. She was cold despite the furs, cold in spirit, but the wine and weed had been liberally mixed, and she couldn't fight the effect. Her last conscious thought was of misery, of being cheated, of the one thing that had made her life bearable. She knew now what a dragonless rider must feel. That is the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4, the first word is black. And that is all I have for tonight. Oh, Granny Bear says Mendacious is lying or telling a false story. Okay.
Hi. Daniel says good night. And I see Granny Bear's there. I see we have 4 people online, which is amazing. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And obviously it's mostly been Mom reading tonight and me reading one small chapter from Colossians. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we will look forward to having you back again tomorrow night when we get more Heavy D storytelling. God bless you guys. Have a good night.